Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be checking out this new Toxik record, the long-awaited follow-up to 1989's Think This, Morta. I do have a bit of a serious love-hate relationship with this band. World Circus and Think This are both incredible thrash metal records that hold their own with the best albums in the genre. They fit right into that same wave of thrash bands that were on the precipice of death metal in the late 80s that very quickly could not adapt during the 90s and thus vanished for years and years. Bands like Nuclear Assault or Sanctuary were part of that wave, mainly influenced by the poser killer attitude of bands like Overkill or Exodus. And that is a bit of where the hate part comes into this. A lot of the most obnoxious people I know cannot help but jerk this band off endlessly. But hey, that's not the band's fault, that's just been my experience with, a pretty decent amount of fans. Don't get me wrong either, I don't really mind heavy metal gatekeeping, but like, for Toxik, it just seems like kind of a really weird brand of it. So Toxik vanished for the better part of a decade, briefly reformed in 2007 after their first two albums were re-released, and then they split again and then reformed again in 2013 and expected a new record out in 2014. That of course did not happen. Years go by after several album delays, the first to 2016, then to 2017, then complete radio silence until like 2020. And now it's finally here in 2022, almost 9 years after the album was first announced. And I'll be totally honest, I went into this album a bit apprehensive. I totally thought that this was going to be a total mess, but instead what Toxik have spent the better part of a decade making is one of the better true contemporary thrash albums of the past few years. And don't get me wrong, this album has its problems, but there's not really any glaring issues. And I feel like I can kind of chalk that up to all but one of the members of this band being non-original members. A lot of these classic heavy metal bands have had a habit, a bad habit that is, of trying to reform classic lineups, and historically I haven't really seen much success with that strategy. I mean, Toxik's vocalist for this album, Ron Iglesias, is in like his 30s. This man was a baby when the first two Toxik albums came out, and I don't even actually think he was around for the first one. But we got a lot of these bands that'll reunite with their classic lineup, and a lot of these dudes, like, it's not like a reunion of like a classic thrash band like 10, 20 years ago where, they're in their maybe late 30s or something. Like, a lot of these guys now are hitting their mid-50s, early 60s even, so it's honestly kind of a smart move to really just keep new blood moving through a lot of these bands. Like, I kind of can't hate it. Like, say what you will, having a fresh, young vocalist who can hit a very wide range of notes is a very smart move. And as far as reunion albums go, I'd say this is probably the best since Kirith Ungol's 2020 comeback Forever Black. And as for each song, there's really not any duds here. There's just kind of moments where maybe some sample work is questionable, like the intro of The Radical that samples that viral video of that Walmart lady calling people motherfucker and then calling them accusers, which does kind of work as a sample on paper, but hearing it in this context is kind of surreal, a little bit weird. There could have been better things that they could have gone with. I don't know, I mean, this is just kind of a moment where I'm scratching my head. Although there also could have been like way worse samples they could have gone with, so hey, you win some, you lose some. And I know I also compared Toxik's work to Sanctuary earlier, but this album sounds a lot like Refuge Denied at a lot of points. There's parts of Feeding Frenzy that sound a lot like if you were to take Battle Angels and maybe hit it with some like Years of Decay era Overkill. And that's kind of how a lot of this album sounds. It's like true raw thrash worship to the core, which I feel like I've seen done wrong time and time again. I mean, there's dozens of bands out there that never really did split up and have continued to put out material consistently and have become a lot bigger than Toxik as a result of that releasing schedule, every few years, just drop another album. But a lot of these bands that are putting stuff out that can't even hold a candle to this album. And I'm not saying that lightly either. While there are scarce moments on this album that are maybe a little bit too campy, it never feels like this album is trying to be held to a higher standard than it belongs to. And even the last three tracks, which feel a little bit more serious, don't feel like they're trying to preach. They're just kind of hitting on some more of the more traditional Sabbath heavy notes that honestly provide some really nice variety right at the end of the album, changing things up kind of just enough to keep you engaged. Also, I don't think I've touched on it yet, but the guitar work on this album is ridiculous. It is so shred heavy. Obviously, guitar solos are a staple of thrash metal and pretty much always have been, but here, I mean, it is really heavily brought right to the front of the track. It's riff after major riff into incredibly impressive and technical solos that don't get so technical as to hit the more obnoxious sides of prog metal, but not simple enough as to need to rely on a wah pedal for everything. I think the only part on the album that doesn't really land very well is maybe the intro to Devil in the Mirror, which is a piano piece with some light ballad-like vocals, which isn't really bad as far as performances go, but it is kind of a weird inclusion when it doesn't really help with the pacing of the album, or even really the track that much. The rest of the song is very good though, no complaints there, just the intro that kind of lands wrong for me personally. Also, I hadn't mentioned this yet either, the production on this album is surprisingly really good. Like, compare any track on this album to the new Megadeth singles, and whoever they've got on this album really just nailed the sound of this record. It's full, it's not too clean, and it's got a really, really good amount of track dynamics. Chris Rakestraw could honestly stand to take some notes. As far as the highlights go, I think Feeding Frenzy just crushes. Hyper Reality with its 90s-like vision of the future is cool. Straight Razor is a rager, and the final track, Judas, is just a really great album closer with some really solid solo work and some of the more interesting change-ups on the record. I do see the Radical, Power, and maybe Creating the Abyss as kind of middle-of-the-road tracks, nothing too crazy, but still pretty good. And I don't really think I hated any of the songs here. This isn't a masterpiece of an album, but it is, to me, a very rare case of a comeback record done right. I'm thinking Morta is a pretty solid 7, maybe an 8. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this album in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.